Very much appreciate you all being here today. My name is Mike McGee. I lead an organization called Chiefs for Change. We have over 24 members who are state education chiefs and urban school superintendents who collectively serve about 7.5 million kids. Today we're going to be talking about how systems are taking advantage of the federal ESSA law to improve schools across their states and systems. It's an area of policy that I've gotten to know very well at Chiefs for Change. We were able to lead a working group with 15 states who collectively served about 1 out of every 3 kids in the country as they developed their ESSA plans. And some of that work is now bearing fruit. We are in the phase where people are implementing those plans, and it's been very exciting to see some of the work going on to take advantage of that law to provide much better opportunities for students across states, including some of the states that are within Chiefs for Change membership. A lot of the most exciting work in this regard, I think, is happening in the state of Texas, and we're very lucky to have 2 leaders who are doing that work in Texas right now. Dan Fishman, who's the Vice President of Growth at IDEA Public Schools, and Joe Sidlecki, who's the Associate Commissioner of the Texas Education Agency. Kunjan Narachania, who leads the school improvement work in Louisiana, was also supposed to join us, but unfortunately had an illness which is keeping her from being here today. I thought I would, just in her honor, talk a little bit about the work in Louisiana before we get started, because I think that work is also so relevant to the conversation that we're going to have today. 2 of the things about ESSA that I think have been profound in terms of supporting the work that's happening across states to improve schools is, 1, the unprecedented level of flexibility that it's given states to reimagine how they should be deploying their title funds to improve schools, in particular around Title I school improvement dollars, the dollars that are available to provide direct student services to students, to tailor and individualize supports to struggling students across the state, and then around Title II, where states are really reimagining how they use federal funds to support teachers. And then the second thing about ESSA that I think has been quite important to policymakers in some of the bolder states has been the sort of renewed emphasis on evidence-based school improvement strategies. And when you put those 2 things together, flexibility to decide how you're going to deploy title funds to systems, and an emphasis on evidence-based practices, you can really drive behavior in districts and schools and create new opportunities for partnership between school providers, between teachers, and state policymakers. In Louisiana, they were already quite ahead of the game in terms of creating really unprecedented levels of school choice across the state, and in particularly in New Orleans. One of the things they've done in the wake of ESSA that I think has been complementary and really profound is leverage their Title II dollars to create a large teacher leadership organization across the state, and a program called Louisiana Believes, and then engage those teacher leaders, some of the most highly effective teachers in the state, in the work that they've been doing, in particular to dramatically improve the quality of instructional materials across schools and systems in the state of Louisiana, and the supports they provide for teachers to implement those instructional materials effectively. It's been game-changing across Louisiana in terms of content and instruction in schools across the state. And I think there's a lot to learn from what they've done there. We've been helping a number of the states within Chiefs for Change membership to develop similar strategies with their most highly effective teachers, and I think it's poised to yield some really exciting results for kids. So Joe, I thought I'd start with you to talk a little bit about what's been happening in Texas, how you've been taking advantage of the flexibilities that you were given under ESSA to build a school improvement strategy for the state.
Thanks, Mike. First I'll start by giving a little bit of context. First I'll start by giving a little bit of context about how Texas is the greatest state. But getting quickly past that, because I think it's a known fact. There's really three pieces of local legislation that have actually set the stage for us to leverage the federal ESSA dollars to do things differently. And those things are our state A through F system, which just went into implementation. So previously, the state had a pass-fail accountability system, met standard or improvement required, and then now for the first year, we actually have rated districts A through F. You can actually look at the scale scores of particular schools and see what their A through F rating would be, although that won't be officially announced until next year. So I think that sets the stage for transparency on performance for all the schools and districts in the state. The second one is House Bill 1842, and that's a bill that says that if a district has a single campus that is failing for 5 consecutive years, that the commissioner is compelled to do one of two things: either order the closure of the campus or install a board of managers to take over the district. There's no third option for the commissioner to pursue. He must choose one of those two options. And I think that creates a lot of kind of pressure for districts to get ahead of that curve. And then the third is Senate Bill 1882, and actually the sponsor of that bill, Senator Betancourt, if you want to raise your hand, is here. And that bill created an incentive for districts to partner with institutes of higher education, charter schools, nonprofit organizations, or other governmental entities to partner to operate schools. And the way the bill is written, it provides some incentives, and one of the biggest ones on the accountability side is if a district brings in a partner to manage the school, they get a 2-year accountability pause or sanctions pause. They'll continue to be rated by the state, but the state will not intervene in order closure or take over the district or the board of managers. It's also, that bill can be used to create new schools as well, or to convert existing schools to partnership schools. But in terms of turnaround, it creates a real incentive for districts. So that's kind of big picture, the legislative framework that we're operating under. So then what we did with our ESSA funds, and Texas is a large state, so we've got about $100 million in federal funds in the ESSA 7%, which is discretionary money for school improvement. And the way that we've really broken it up is into 2 tranches. On the one side of the house, I would say we're supporting what would be more traditional school improvement activities, and to use Mike's terms, evidence-based school improvement activities. The agency created something called the Effective Schools Framework, which lays out the basic tenets of what we should see in good schools. It's meant as guidance to districts. And then we give out about $50 million a year, about $40 million a year out to all of the districts with comprehensive schools, which are the federally identified struggling schools. And they need to use those resources to purchase support to improve upon the Effective Schools Framework. And they can get that from their regional service centers. We've got 20 regional service centers in the state of Texas, or they can get that from a vetted list of school improvement partners. So that's on the traditional school improvement side of the house. I think what's more interesting with what we've done with our ESSA dollars is on the other side of the house. So the way we're trying to get districts to think about it is you can either, your turnaround strategies are school improvement or what we call school actions. You can, as a district, take a bolder action like consolidate a school, launch a new school, bring in a partner to operate a school. And on that side, we've created a whole division and an infrastructure and a competitive grant program to support districts that want to do those things differently. And I think the real important piece there is twofold. One is we're telling districts if they want to pursue that strategy, which we call a system of great school strategy, then the agency will provide some technical assistance to help them do that. And then secondarily, if they want to compete for competitive grant dollars for those bolder actions, they can do so. The key thing is, in the past, most, if not all, of the school improvement money given from the feds down to states was spent on school improvement activities. In our ESSA plan, we wrote in that we could use those dollars to create new schools in lieu of improving existing schools. And as you can see from our strategy, we're continuing to do both. But what we're trying to do on one side of the house is to say, rather than trying to improve schools as they exist, we can use this money to launch new schools. And Senate Bill 1882 gives a further incentive to do so. So we're giving people startup and planning money to plan a new school, and then Senate Bill 1882 also has a financial incentive. And if they do it as a charter school, then they continue to get ongoing resources for the support. So I think it's different in that we're kind of frankly stating, like, we want you to actually think of a bolder action than what you've been doing. And that action will provide financial resources and technical assistance to pursue.
Dan, you lead a large and highly effective charter school network. Is there something about this policy framework and what Texas has done that's especially appealing to you all at IDEA? Has it changed some of the conversations you're having with district leadership or created new opportunities for you?
Yeah, it absolutely has. And for the record, I don't lead ideas, so if you have qualms with idea, I can give you the email of our CEO. But I lead our growth into new regions, so I can speak from that perspective. But this, the legislation that Joe was speaking about, and thank you again, Senator Betancourt, 1882 has opened up any number of doors through which IDEA can walk in partnership with districts. So it has changed the way we approach growth into new regions. What I will say, what it's done a lot of is when we go into a new region, here in two, we would go in, and IDEA thinks pretty big. So when we go into a new region, for us, that's typically 20 schools on 10 campuses. It's about 15,000 students. So we're looking for larger markets where there's a large population that's been really underserved, and we're going to go in, and we're going to create a huge proof point, and we're going to serve 5 or 10% of the population and get them into really great schools. So now, districts, rather than seeing that as a threat or a competition, see that as a potential partner, at least in theory. So in theory, the legislation is great in doing that. In practice, it certainly gets a little messier. So right now, we're working specifically with one district. We will likely be working with 2 districts in Texas on potential partnerships. And I think there's a pretty significant upside there for the community, certainly for the kids. But I do think there's also some cautions in that sort of partnership that I'm happy to discuss a little later.
It seems like there's a convergence right now in terms of Texas's strategy, and I'm certainly seeing this in other places, between a strategy to pretty dramatically expand school choices and options for kids and families, and to make sure that that is being done and that people's new school strategies are being married, so to speak, to evidence-based strategies for school improvement. I'm curious, Dan, you know, being part of the leadership team for a large network of high-performing schools, obviously you're taking advantage of and supporting autonomies for your individual schools, but I imagine there are also a set of non-negotiables for your network. How do you at IDEA balance the autonomy that you want to give to school leaders and their teams at the school level, and what the evidence says about what schools need to do in order to serve all kids well?
In terms of how our network operates generally?
Yeah.
So IDEA is a slightly more tightly managed charter network than some others. So there's quite a bit that we do centrally. So we're fairly non-negotiable around a lot of things related to our operations and our finances, and in many cases, the curriculum that's taught. We do give our regions and our schools autonomy over some of the additional programming. They certainly have autonomy over the teachers they hire and the staff in the building. In Louisiana, for example, the way we work on some of our discipline and culture is going to look different than how we would do that in the Rio Grande Valley. So we make accommodations, but we make no bones. There is no compromise around the expectations we have. And we also very rarely make operational compromises, which is partly why we're able to roll out 20 schools, 10 campuses, and do so on the per pupil in states like Texas and soon Florida, where students don't receive nearly as much as they would in say, the District of Columbia.
Joe, I know curriculum can be a pretty dicey political issue at the state level, but it seems like Texas is getting certainly more clear about the kind of practices that you think are going to lead to improved schools. Has the nature of that conversation changed over the last 2 years in Texas, and how are you managing those conversations with school districts, and particularly school districts and schools that are struggling?
Yeah, so I think a couple of points there. So one is to get into, again, to stay on this kind of school improvement side of the house here in our effective schools framework. I think what's in it is not necessarily groundbreaking, right? Strong school leadership and planning, high quality curriculum, positive school culture, well-supported teachers, and effective instruction. Kind of within there, what the agency's been doing is trying to provide a set of resources to districts that they're not compelled to use, but that they're available for in each one of those buckets. And to your point on curriculum, there is an effort, and it's not inside my team in particular, to look at existing curriculum that exists and have Texas teachers rate it against a rubric, and then have a Consumer Reports type rating of like, this is 4-star curriculum, 5-star curriculum for Texas. They're in the early stages of that team, but the idea is like for each one of those buckets I laid out, the agency's trying to create a set of supports that folks could access. Curriculum is a high leverage one. As you said, it's very interesting discussion in Texas because the State Board of Education kind of has authority over curricular decisions. But the idea here is to make sure that like what we're putting out and the rating is good kind of meets Texas standard, and that's what that team's doing.
What I will say is Louisiana did something similar where they graded all of the curriculum, and we were able to see with real clarity when we were going into the state what's good, what's not so good. And we chose to adopt the only fully A-rated curriculum they had. And we realized, hey, this is actually way more rigorous than what we're using in Texas to leap over the bar there.
Hey.
So we went back and we transitioned that into all of our Texas schools. So it was really helpful to have that sort of insight. But what I'll say is that was a voluntary move by IDEA. And if we chose to use a less rigorous curriculum, parents would never know. So it's not the sort of choice where the market is going to force you to make a good choice. It's one that has to be led by the actual educational operator.
Right, and I would say like the state's role in that, and I think I don't want to speak too much for Louisiana though, is to make information available. And I believe Louisiana even goes a little bit further, saying like you'll be preferenced in grant programs if you adopt kind of top tier curriculum. Texas is not there. We're not going to actually be as directive with our local districts, but what we're going to just give them information so that they can make better decisions. And again, that's on the school improvement side of the house.
Dan, it sounds like state policy and the changes you've seen in state policy over the last couple of years are having an impact on how you analyze opportunities in new state markets. I know there are things like the Schools of Hope legislation in Florida. How are you evaluating opportunities based on the state policy landscape? Are there, if you had to name 2 or 3 things that are especially appealing to IDEA to enter a state, whether it is to just open new IDEA schools or to partner with school districts, how are you evaluating those opportunities right now?
Well, it has a huge impact on how we think about this. How many folks out there are from Florida? I'm just curious. Oh, music and hands to my ears. All right, despite having terrible sports teams, you have some of the best education legislation in the country. So I do want to give a big shout out to, what I would consider the 97 bulls of legislators who got through this Schools of Hope legislation. I don't know if Chairman Corcoran or Representative Sprowls or Bielek are out there, but thank you for really making this happen. And ExcelinEd was integral in this and has been positioning the state for years to make this happen. But if you'd asked me if we would go to Florida 2 years ago, I think the answer would have been an unflinching no. There was very little that was attractive about Florida as an operator, outside of the fact that there were a lot of really capable kids here who were being underserved by the schools in the state. What Schools of Hope did is it took Florida from something that folks were aware of was on a map to a state that folks were really focused on in a short amount of time. And I'm not just speaking for IDEA. I just got off the phone with another very high quality operator that is eager to go to Florida. There are at this point 4 Hope operators, which are the entities that this legislation was designed to attract. Only one of them was previously in the state, so 3 have been brought in now, and they plan to replicate quickly and to grow great schools for kids. So if I can just talk for a moment about why the Hope legislation was so important for us. Okay, so the Hope legislation was pretty game-changing for us because, one, it was really built with specific charter operators in mind. It wasn't legislation that was passed because it seemed like it would possibly bring in the right people. Many individuals from Florida sat down, not just with IDEA, but with 2 dozen different charter school operators with proven records from all over the country to say what's missing and what should we be doing. And not only did that result in better legislation, but it really created a sense of buy-in from us. I mean, we wanted to see this get across the finish line because we felt like we had a stake in it. So I thought that was a really brilliant stroke to make sure the legislation had support, and then once it was passed, actually performed as expected. 2, I think what the legislation contains, there's I don't know if you've heard this term, but there's a movement to have more quarterbacks in education. People sort of calling the ball and figuring out what's going to happen. What I like about this legislation is it really plays the role of an offensive line. Really clears barriers out of the way and opens up a hole for charter school networks to run through, high quality charter school networks. So I appreciate that it removed barriers for us and created a clear set of expectations, but wasn't too prescriptive about where we had to serve and how we had to serve, while still putting enough, I think, safeguards in place that we would be serving low income students who otherwise would attend failing schools. I also like that, and I know, my peers in the charter world appreciate that funding isn't specifically earmarked in a way that makes it largely useless. So there's a large pot of money that's intended to attract high-quality operators. I think the worst thing the state could have done was said 30 million for this, 20 million for this, 20 million for this. What they did is they put this money in, and they gave a long list of things that they had vetted that these funds could be used for, and it falls to us to figure out, can we use this and how can we use it? So it really allows us to use the money within our budget rather than have to build a budget around what the state thinks we need. So I really like that it left a lot of latitude there. And lastly, and this is, kudos to the legislators who are there now, there's a real commitment to fine-tune this legislation. So like all legislation, it's imperfect, it's a living document. I think it's about 95% of the way there, and it's some of the most useful ed legislation I think that this country's seen in a decade. Having said that, it's imperfect, and it's already becoming dated in some ways, and I know that they are committed to going back and fixing it. So I think that's the other really critical piece about this, is no one says, all right, we did it, we put out the flag for great schools to come, we can go move on to the next issue. Because if the state of Florida did that today, I don't know that they would actually see really any schools of hope in the next 2 or 3 years. The last thing, this is sort of a bonus. It doesn't have to do with the ledge, but it's something where if it doesn't exist, none of this will matter. Florida has a really good Department of Education, and they have a really good new commissioner who's about to come on board. So if you pass this miracle legislation that's going to bring, KIP and Success Academy and IDEA and every other great charter you've ever dreamed about, and they're going to get the job done, but you turn this over to an incapable DOE that's going to move slow, that's going to throw up hurdles, they're going to wear us down. I mean, they have more time and capacity than we do. So what I love about Florida, and Texas is similar, very high-functioning departments of education that genuinely want to do right by kids and by the schools that do right by kids. So if you don't have that in place, but you pass great legislation, you're only halfway there.
I would just underscore that point for a moment. One of the things we did recently at Chiefs for Change was release a report on sustained education leadership in the U.S. And what we found was that in systems where you've had sustained, reform-minded, highly effective leadership for a decade or more, they're on any reliable measurement of student outcomes, they are absolute outliers in terms of results. It really does matter enormously. Effective leaders in this space get everyone rowing in the same direction, and it just makes the work so much easier. Not easy, but so much easier. So I very much appreciate that. Joe had mentioned, I'm curious, both related to what you were saying about the Schools of Hope legislation and about what Joe had said earlier about Texas's efforts to make its accountability system more rigorous. We often talk about the need, particularly when you're dramatically expanding school choice in a state or a district, to provide assurances around quality so that people can feel confident that what is actually a pretty big shock to the system often is going to account for quality. When you look at systems like Texas, where they are really holding schools accountable for getting great results with kids, is that especially appealing to you? I imagine it's not anything you're afraid of, but do you think it helps create the kind of healthy system that you want to operate in?
Yes. Yeah, I absolutely do. I mean, I think one of the hardest things for us to go into is, and this probably isn't the most PC term, but a very contaminated charter sector, where it's a bunch of low-performing schools none of you would ever send your kids to. Because if that's the fact, that those are the facts on the ground, when we come in, the press is already writing about how we're a for-profit charter school who, is here to take money away and add to the problem, and they're only half wrong. If every charter has failed, I don't think that skepticism is unwarranted. So I think having a really, really high bar is actually really good for ideas, and it's good for KIPS, and it's good for the other high-performing charter schools of the world. And I can tell you, in every closed-door conversation we've had, we have never said we don't want to go to that state because the accountability is too strict. That's yet to ever happen. I think if you look across the U.S., there's a much bigger problem with things swinging the other direction than us holding schools too accountable. So that has never scared us away.
Joe, I'm curious, one of the things we've seen is that effective leaders, when they are working, particularly with charter partners to expand school choice, they're very much on top of these issues of providing assurances to the public, not just about quality, but I would say the two others that seem to matter enormously are around equitable access to schools and around equitable funding for schools. Because these are the areas where suspicions can arise in the public, particularly when you have issues around quality. Are you all thinking about those issues in Texas, about how you provide assurances to the public that the law is being used effectively and in their best interests?
Yeah, yes, but I'll start with kind of what we're doing to help districts send those messages and get those things right. So I had mentioned our kind of school action grants, and it's about $40 million a year to create new schools, replicate successful schools, close and consolidate, and those types of dramatic actions. Kind of paired with that is something that we have called the System of Great Schools Network, and that's for districts that are interested in pursuing school actions to opt into. And what the agency then does is help them do kind of three core things, or really four. One is conduct an annual kind of evaluation of the schools in their district to determine how they're performing, but also what the community wants and needs. Second is conducting an annual call for quality schools, where they're seeking external partners like an idea or internal teams of educators to design and launch and lead new schools. And then the third thing is to actually make clear to families what their options are and make it easier for families to enroll in those options. The last one is to do some organizational changes like create an Office of Innovation or Transformation to oversee that work. But how we're trying to address what you talked about there is kind of at that local level is to build the district's capacity to understand, like, here's the processes that you could follow, and here's the requirements that you should put on your partners, right? So in order to be approved as an 1882 partner, the contracts have to have certain things in them. Performance stipulations are one of them. And that's one of the few things that the agency really looks deeply at, so that we could say, hey, this isn't kind of an operator brought in on a blank slate in a contract to run a school forever. They've got to deliver a result. And on the equitable access side, we're really trying to work with districts to help them kind of, one, make known to their parents what their options are and make it easier to evolve. At the state level, we've actually launched something called txschools.org, which is a statewide website that ranks every single school in the state quite clearly. And that's kind of a starting point for giving families the type of information that they need. If you go to most DOE websites, good luck trying to find school performance data. So that doesn't solve like the equitable access, but it's starting to say like, hey, here's at least some kind of common information that people can have.
I'm curious, I mean, we all know that in particular, when you're trying to turn around struggling schools, you're not going to get where you need to go if you don't have talented school leaders and talented teachers. And one of the things we certainly see across the country is just enormous challenges around human capital when you're trying to mount some of these new efforts. Are those challenges that you're trying to address, Joe, in policy? And Dan, are there things about states' efforts around human capital that are especially appealing to you? I know, for instance, that San Antonio has a unique partnership with Relay Graduate School of Education now that's really innovative and interesting. Are there things from either of you that you think are especially effective that you're working on?
I don't know if they're effective yet, but they sound like good ideas, and we're pursuing them. So a couple of things that we're doing is kind of on the principal side is twofold. One, at the state agency level, we run a principal residency grant, which we just launched. And the idea here is to launch principal residency, so a principal gets to spend a year kind of in an existing school learning from a mentor principal, at the same time getting their master's degree from a high-quality institution like Relay Graduate School of Education or Texas Tech, for example. So we just launched that grant program. The idea here is like to start building that pipeline. Similarly, we have a Grow Your Own Teacher grant, which is actually helping districts to get their best students interested in coming back after college to teach in the district, right? So that's a long game, but the idea here is, can you take our top tier students and get them interested in this profession before they go to college? And then the third thing we're doing at the state level is providing incentives for Relay Graduate School of Education, New Leaders for New Schools, Teaching Trust, organizations like that to set up shop and expand in Texas. And you mentioned what they're doing in San Antonio, but Relay's likely going out to West Texas here next year to run a similar program. Teaching Trust is in Fort Worth, and they're likely to expand into East Texas. So there's a whole effort at the agency level on the pipeline side. Similarly, on principal cert, we're actually changing principal certification to make it actually more rigorous and more task-based than it was in the past. So the idea is like we're trying to build a pipeline of programs that will prepare people to be able to lead effectively, but we're also raising the bar for what it means to be a principal in Texas. That's at the state level. We're also, through SGS, working with districts to get them to think similarly, to say, if you're going to select internal educators to launch new schools, what can you set up to support those leaders to actually be effective leaders? So we're working at multiple levels, certification, state-level programs, and then trying to support districts themselves to think of how to use their dollars, not the state's dollars, more effectively to build the pipelines they need to lead and staff these new schools that we're incentivizing the creation of.
Dan, can a state help you on the human capital side? Are there things they can do, or how do you approach that problem in general?
I think it's easier for a state to hurt than to help in this instance. I think where we often run into some troubles is when there's really strict regulation around where and how a teacher has to be certified. So when there's a very limited number of programs that teachers can go through to get their certification, and then we have to either hire those teachers or send our teachers through that in addition to putting them through an in-house program or a program with someone like Relay. That is really not helpful. And when we think about, we have a scorecard we use, and there's 8 different criteria when we're thinking about where we want to grow to. If it's really prescriptive about how we have to certify our teachers and the partners are not good, that's a real black mark against the state, because we feel, and we are always getting better, we're not there yet, but we feel we're really good at preparing our teachers to be excellent instructors. We do not have that confidence in 99.5% of teacher preparation programs out there. So if you take high-performing organizations and tell them how they have to prepare their teachers, that's a recipe for disaster. So we love working with groups like Relay, which Joe mentioned is expanding all over Texas. And in those instances, when a state can allow Relay to be a certifying body, terrific. We love to work with them. We know we're going to have high-quality instruction. But short of that, removing some of this regulation that does little to ensure high-quality instruction is just about the best thing a state can do when working with high-quality educational providers.
So, Mike, I'll give a story. Dan and I talked, and I'm not going to name the districts because we're in the midst of conversations. But when we were talking about some districts that wanted to pursue partnerships with IDEA, one of the first questions Dan asked is like, there is a massive talent gap out there, and it's not just the talent of the people, like literally numbers of teachers and numbers of principals are low. What is the state going to do about it? So like we shared some of that, but I also think one important point to make is when you bring in innovative organizations like an IDEA, or I don't want to say the name of it, or like some of the more locally grown operators that are coming out of 1882, in some respects, that's going to help attract a different talent base to that community as well. It's not a surefire, if you launch one campus, you're going to get 200 new teachers out of it. But the idea here is if you can actually create the conditions where it's more conducive for teachers to work in effective organizations like an IDEA, it actually might help build that pipeline too. So it's both a kind of push in, like the state's doing what we can to try to build a pipeline, but we also feel like having folks like IDEA or others like them operating in those communities will attract teachers to those organizations, and therefore the districts, because under 1882, they remain district schools. It's not an either-or proposition.
And to any of the legislators in the audience, if you want to come teach civics at an IDEA school in Texas, we're happy to provide a handsome relocation bonus. To Joe's point, we don't have enough teachers out there.
Well, I want to make sure we leave plenty of time for questions, so I'll open it up to the floor.
Joe, I'm on the state board in Colorado, and you have 5 years on the turnaround clock, and then the commissioner has to make decisions. What happens after that? Has your legislature come up with, now what? 3 years down the road, what if those schools are still failing?
So I think, the question, I'll just repeat it, was in Texas, and I talked about House Bill 1842, which says that a district has 5 years to basically turn around a campus, or the commissioner must order closure of the campus, or take over the district with the Board of Managers. I want to add one other point. That is for district schools. For charter schools have 3 years, right? So that kind of bargain of more autonomy for more accountability you can see there. Charter schools have just 3 years to get it right, and if they fail 3 years in a row on either academics or finance, then the state closes them, and we closed 36 charter schools over the last 5 years as a result of that. But what I'll say to answer your question more specifically here is, 1842 is actually a relatively new law as well. So we don't have that many districts that have kind of fallen into that situation. But the idea here is if we order closure, then we're writing a set of rules right now that says if the commissioner orders closure of the campus, how can that campus be repurposed or reused? And we're actually going to create a very high bar that there has to be kind of a majority of new grade levels, all new staff, distinctly different academic program. And we're going to provide incentives through that rule, which is not out yet. We're currently writing it to say, and if you bring in a partner operator that runs A or B schools, of which IDEA would be an example, that meets the test. Right, so like we're not quite there yet. We have ordered the closure of a couple of schools, and the districts have just let them buildings sit vacant. But the idea is we want to be clear for folks, what can you do to relaunch that school? But it's got to be a brand new school. On the boards of managers, that's a whole nother issue. We're trying to support boards with a program called Lone Star Governance, so that when you get a new board, we're training the school boards on what their roles is. And that's not debating the color of the bus or the name of the football stadium. It ought to be setting student outcome goals and relentlessly focusing on that and pressing the district to deliver, but not telling them what program to buy and what thing to do. So this is all hypothesis because these are all things that started under Commissioner Morath, and they're starting to kind of like come into being right now. So we just have our first sets of schools
Can I
in those
just do a short
situations.
follow-up on that?
Yep.
So the other option that your commissioner had was to bring in outside management after 5 years, is that correct?
Yep.
And how long does that go on, just that outside
Yep.
management? And then I'm assuming there's closure after that for,
So you're close. Outside alternative management is eligible when the commissioner rejects a district's turnaround plan for their campus, which is separate from 5 consecutive years of failure. So what I just described, though, effectively is we're trying to create a rule that incentivizes alternative management as a solution.
how long do you have with the alternative management?
Similar. Well, we don't have any in that situation right now, so we
Okay.
actually haven't gotten to that
Okay.
place.
Thank you.
I would give a quick shout out. Joe mentioned the Lone Star governance effort, which I think is something that's been really effective in Texas. In going around the state, I mean, we have something like 600,000 school districts in Texas. It's obviously,
1,207.
yeah, it is a monumental number of districts and boards and superintendents. And I've met with school boards that have gone through this program, and candidly, they will tell you, before I went through this program, I thought I worked for the superintendent. They didn't even understand that their role was to oversee and govern. So this investment by the state of Texas, I think, is really paying dividends in terms of improving governance at a pretty low cost. So I think it's worth looking at what Texas has done, especially if your state has a proliferation of school boards and it's very hard to manage them.
Except in Ohio, where we have 608 school districts, more than anybody in the country. My name is Norman. I am a board member in Trotwood-Madison City Schools, and there's a piece of legislation in Ohio very similar to what you were discussing in terms of matters of state takeovers called House Bill 70. And I hope there are some Ohio legislators in here, because I don't think that piece of legislation kept in mind what actually happens on the local level when districts are in fear of being taken over by the state. Currently, the legislation in Ohio says that if a district is consistently failing over 3 years, that the state puts together an academic distress commission. That commission selects or hires what they call a CEO, who sits over the entire organization, who has all academic authority, all economic authority, can spend whatever he or she wants to without being really responsible to anyone. And the only thing that the elected body is left to do is, of course, put levies on ballots when all the money's gone and create policy that the CEO doesn't have to adhere to. The issue in Ohio is that where this has taken place in East Cleveland, in Canton, in Youngstown, the districts are doing worse than they were before the state came in with this awful really bad piece of legislation. And so I guess mine is more of a comment than a question, that if there's anybody, please take into consideration your local boards of education and how this really rips apart local districts who don't know exactly what is going on. School boards happen to be the most contentious level of politics because you're dealing with people's kids so closely. And then kind of to her effect, what happens or how soon does the state in Texas intervene when they realize that this system is not working?
Yeah, there's tons of, it's not just Ohio, there's stories of districts that were taken over in New Jersey and under state control for 30-some years and just getting worse and worse and worse. I'm thinking of Patterson, actually, in particular. So I would say, like, something that the agencies try to do, and we haven't gotten everything right for sure, and we're in the early stages of this, is if we're going to be in a position where the commissioner has to choose to either close schools or install a board of managers, that the agency also has to provide supports that those districts can opt into, that are of high quality, that can help them pick a theory of action, if you will. System of great schools, we're going to take bold actions, bring in partners, create new schools, or on the effective schools framework side, like more of a kind of managed instruction focus. Not compel folks to pursue any one path, but to give them the options and give them the tools so that they can do so. Because absent that, right, it's just you install a board of managers and then what, right? It's a great question. In Texas, we're trying to answer the and then what, right? It's not just install a board of managers and train them, it's give them access to a clear set of supports, regardless of which kind of theory of action they want to pursue at the district level.
Yeah, I would just add quickly that, we've seen a number of places where you have pretty unprecedented levels of community engagement with school improvement efforts. That feels quite new and, to me, and leaves me optimistic. I do think we're entering an era where if you're trying to do things to communities rather than with them, you're not going to get very far. And so we've certainly been supporting a number of our leaders across Chiefs for Change membership to just do a much more robust level of community engagement, connected in deep ways to their school improvement efforts that I'm pretty excited about. Yes.
Thank you, Michael. I'm Senator Paul Betancourt, and we have over 1,000 school districts in Texas. Okay, so we'll keep upping the ante till one of us wins the debate. What Joe and Daniel and their bosses, and we're very lucky to have, I think, one of the best education commissioners in the country, that's Mike Morath. What 1882 bill did was, it was the carrot on the hammer that we already had passed. And the carrot was simply this: if you work together, you will give you incentives from the state to have public-private partnerships, because there's always concern in the community what happens. Now, we did that right when we authored the bill, because we had a more liberal Democrat friend of mine, who is the senator from San Antonio, partner up with the more conservative Republican from Houston on purpose, because we had school districts, like so many in the country, that have excess capacity, have excess plant, they've got excess schools that are not being used. And I saw in Houston a partnership that was already working with a public school system and KIPP and YES academies. Now, but more importantly, this gives you permutations of the outcome, which is just something that they're both talking about. So we're a big believer in incentives for good behavior, because that's the way to get people past the fear of making the step. Now, we've got our largest school district in the state is right up the cusp of having to make these decisions. But they've got two options. They've got either the hammer, which is the bill that says if you don't, you're going to be out and a board of governors is going to show up, or they have Senate Bill 1882, which they can work together for a positive outcome. I think it's been a very effective combination. If anybody wants to see me after class, do so. But Joe, would you take it from there? I think you had a note I can already see you want to talk about.
So in addition to the incentive that the law provides, in the way that we kind of wrote the rule, there's another key piece, and this gets back to Mike's original point about how we're using ESSA. So this is state law. But then how we're using ESSA in the School Action Fund is to say, if a district is going to enter into one of these partnerships, we will give them up to $1.5 million up front to plan and do the first year of the implementation. And then the bill itself says that there'll be ongoing additional financial incentives. And it really depends upon the size of the district and the demographic of the school and whatnot, but I'll just kind of net it out. It comes out to, on average, about $1 million for that school for the duration of the partnership. So if they were going to enter into an agreement with, say, Idea Public Schools, a district, they'd get potentially $1.5 million up front in support through our ESSA School Action Fund, and then $1 million for 10 years to operate the school. And it's not just, and here's something, Dan, I'm curious how you think about this. That money doesn't go to the operator. It goes to the district. And then the district and operator or partner have to negotiate that split, right? So there's some things that it makes it a little messy, but like this way it's actually the incentive for the district to do this work. But my point is like we're taking state law and then using federal dollars that we've gotten approval on our ESSA plan, so thanks to anybody in USDE who was here and read our plan, because it was the only plan that included the creation of new schools in it with our ESSA dollars. But we're giving money up front to make sure it was a strong planning option, and then money ongoing for the operation of the school. I'm curious if you got thoughts on the money going to the district versus to the partner.
Oh, I have thoughts. So I think this legislation was designed in a way that really does facilitate partnership, and we have had districts come out of the works that never would have really spoken to us as potential partners before. So that was the intention of the legislation, and I think it's been very effective in that sense. I do think there is a cost to these partnerships that isn't always considered. I think when you have something like School of Hope, you are able to come in and, we as IDEA need to locate within 5 miles of a failing school. And that allows us the latitude to decide where we're going to go, how we're going to go there, and to replicate what we've always done, which is building a very successful school from the ground up, establishing our culture, controlling all of our systems. What's challenging about this is the reason folks want an IDEA or a similar network is because consistency. They know they're going to get a very consistently good school. When you tell us we can no longer replicate the way we always replicate, you really jeopardize that consistency. And we can handle that once or twice or 3 times. But if the goal here is to have every one of these schools partner with an IDEA, every time we have to change up elements of our model, and maybe it's just the operations, but maybe it's some other element, it does jeopardize the replicability and the consistency. I'd also say our number one resource by far, probably like many of you, is our time. And I can tell you I've spent an inordinate amount of time this year negotiating these contracts with some potential partners in Texas. And that's time I haven't been able to spend working on new regions or replicating schools, which arguably is a much quicker way for us to grow. And lastly, if you think of the unit of measurement here as the number of children served, often when we do these partnerships, it's going to take us as much or more effort to serve fewer students than if we were able to build from the ground up and do it with our tried and true process. So none of these are reasons to say these partnerships don't work or can't work. We're really excited to explore them. But I just want to caution you, if your thought is you're going to put 100 schools into a similar process and 1 or 2 operators who are proven are going to be able to go in and partner with them, it's just not going to happen. So it's effective, but there are some limitations on it.
One other point I'd make, building off of Joe's point, is ESSA plans are not set in stone. So when Joe talks about what's unique about Texas's plan, and in particular the ability to deploy Title I school improvement dollars for the purposes of opening new schools, other states could start to emulate that strategy. They just have to change their ESSA plan.
Yeah, and I would say if you're really interested, you can go to the TEA website, download our ESSA plans on pages 32 and 33. We list out the novel ways that we propose to use the dollars. And I talked about launching the new schools, and we say as district or charter. We also laid out there replicating existing successful schools, whether they're district or charter, and that's something districts rarely do. Most districts do have high-performing, high-poverty schools. They've never actually kind of thought about how would I replicate this. They generally take a school leader, elevate them to a management position where they don't actually have control over the schools that they're managing. And what we're doing, and we have programs to say, can we take that leader, help them actually codify their model, give them control over 2 or 3 or more campuses, and have them operate as an in-district authorized charter school. We've got a whole program for that too. But like on our ESSA plan, pages 32 and 33 list that out. The one other thing that I say that I think is really important, and we did with a small one-time grant, well, it wasn't small, it was $35 million, but small in Texas, we gave grants to districts because this is a bullet in our ESSA plan for them to build the capacity to annually evaluate their portfolio of schools, plan and execute school actions. So what we got out of that was a number of districts that created offices of innovation or transformation. They call them different things, but that actually we were able to give that money to districts to say, this is a school improvement effort because we're building the capacity of the districts to continually do that. But I think it's a really interesting list of things that we've got on there, and I do encourage any other state to take a look at them and adjust your ESSA plan accordingly.
I think we had another question in the back here. Do you have a microphone?
Here we
Or
go.
right here. Oh,
Hi,
perfect. Okay.
I'm Brad Paquette. I actually am a civics teacher who just became a legislator. So if I can't achieve the legislative reform in the next couple of years, then I might be taking you up on that bonus and moving to Texas. However, my question has to do with how do you guys support folks, maybe such as myself, to bring people on board to make that legislation happen, like in Florida in these areas? Like, do you guys offer support systems to folks who are budding and trying to make that happen?
I'll say this. I've spent the last couple of weeks on the phone with folks from North Carolina and actually on the phone with some folks from Michigan to try to explain what we've done. But no, we haven't created any sort of playbook for like, here's the set of things that existed in Texas that made this possible. It's a really good idea, and I know the ExcelinEd folks do that type of work. So maybe that's a plug for them to actually come look at this, and as well as what's happened in Florida, because it's a slightly different approach, right? In Florida, it says partners can go, or operators can go locate in communities where schools are needed, and in Texas, we're saying we're incentivizing districts to partner with operators. So there's a thing, but they're both very novel approaches, and hopefully will be successful for kids.
Yeah, I mean, I would highly encourage you to talk with the ExcelinEd folks. We've worked in states where they have contracted with ExcelinEd to come and help them do exactly this, and I think it's helped push things along. And the other thing I'd say Florida and Texas have done well is just start with the end in mind. So what schools do you want to be there? And if it is a particular set of schools you have your eye on, I'd talk to them about what are the conditions that they need that would make them consider, I'm sorry, what state are you visiting from? Michigan, okay.
One more, all right.
There we go. Yeah.
Hey, Matt Minnick here from Teach for America. Maybe I'm the kid that's the what are we going to do next guy. But all this, this is great, all about the school turnarounds. And being in Florida, I've certainly seen some of the beginning impacts of Schools of Hope. One thing I've seen is that you get this galvanizing leader, maybe a principal comes in, and they have this transformational impact in a school, and they take a school from an F all the way to an A, right? And then as pretty much everybody in the world, other than maybe Nick Saban, has found out, it's a lot harder to sustain at the mountaintop than maybe it is to get there. As hard as it is to get there, it's harder to sustain. And so I'm wondering, when you think about 5 or 10 years later, what kinds of structures or supports are put in place once a school has been turned around or a district has been turned around to sustain that turnaround? I mean, do you just keep offering the same supports that were originally there, or is it different sets of support?
I'll answer, and there's a couple of thoughts. So one way that I look at the work that we're doing and that 1882 enables and that we're using ESSA money for is we're creating new institutions, right? Those are the nonprofit organizations that are going to manage these schools. Some of them exist already, and you know them by name: IDEA, KIP, Yes, Uplift. Others are actually being created as a result of this legislation. In Texas, for example, we've created, well, not we've incentivized the creation of Relay Lab schools. So Relay Graduate School of Education now runs schools as a school management organization in Texas. Out in West Texas, there's something called the Ector County Success Network, which came out of Texas Tech. And my point there is that it's a great point. Like, oftentimes what districts do is like they bring in an inspirational, or he or she turns around the school and then they move on to the next school. What we're trying to do is create organizations. And Senate Bill 1882 requires that these organizations have boards, right? So one way I would answer that is our hope is that it's not just a talent strategy or a turnaround strategy. It is a institution creation strategy, and that the idea that these organizations, nonprofits with boards, will persist and be more likely to persist without the dysfunction that occurs sometimes in districts with school boards. Sometimes, not always. And then the other thing I would say is we think, although there's very little that we can do at the state agency, that like the local civic community needs to kind of galvanize around a set of things like new school creation, talent pipeline building, and then partnering with and pressuring the districts to follow through on these strategies. And I think, Dan, you can speak to that. I mean, you're in New Louisiana as a result of one of those organizations. Would you say that? So I'd say like it's both like we're trying to incentivize the creation of new organizations that will live beyond kind of a particular leader, as well as like use the bully pulpit to encourage local civic communities to kind of get on the same page about what they want to see from their district, help them execute it, but also like help them stay the course through inevitable leadership changes.
I would just add quickly, that we do not nationally have anywhere near the level of investment that we need in leadership development in education. I mean, nowhere near it. So that's part of the reason it's encouraging to hear that Texas is taking this on. There are a number of other states that are. We actually know a lot about developing principals, but there's just way too few places that are putting that knowledge into action. A few years ago at Chiefs for Change, we created a program called Future Chiefs, which is designed to support leaders who are just a year or two away from leading their own urban school systems or state departments of education. Within a fairly short period of time, that program has led to superintendents who now serve over 1 million students and manage budgets of over $10 billion annually. Like, this is all possible, but it needs to happen across the entire pipeline, from teacher leaders and assistant principals to principals and all the way up until you have folks leading large systems. We just don't have anywhere near the investment we need to make that happen right now.
I want to emphasize what you said, Matt, with a bit of data. I just looked this up on the plane ride here, actually, for Florida. So about 3,300 schools, about 160 of them got a D or F for 3 of the last 4 years. So about 5% of the schools in the state. There were 153 schools that went from a D or an F to a C, so they got off of the persistently low performing list and went right back to a D or F, so about 5%. And I imagine the Venn diagram there, there's probably a lot of overlap. So there's no shortage of schools that figure out how to get up, whether it be from some miracle principle or gamesmanship, and then they fall right back down. So it's a very serious problem. A very wise man told me that it's a lot easier to give birth than to bring someone back from the dead. So I would say you want to invest in entities that have all the systems in place to do this right from the get-go and don't require a miracle principle to come in and carry all the water, and if they leave, the whole thing comes down with them. And I think you probably know, as do Joe and I and Mike, the 20 or 30 organizations that can do that, and the types of legislation that give schools the autonomy to do exactly that.
Time for just one more question.
Hi, Daniel, my name is Spencer Roach from Florida. Just a quick question. I appreciate your comments and praise for Schools of Hope and some of the reform legislation to come out of the Florida legislature, but you mentioned that it was about 95% there, needed some tweaks. I was curious to know what tweaks you think it needs.
So our ability, and thank you, that's a great question. Our ability to serve in Florida in specific areas is tied to which schools are defined as persistently low performing. And the reason I looked up the data that I just shared with Matt is because a number of these schools have found a way to go from a D or an F to a C, and I suspect they're going to go right back to a D or an F. But that removes them from eligibility. So we can't serve the kids in that neighborhood anymore because for 1 year, by whatever means, they managed to eke out a C. So that's certainly a tweak we need to make, or you're not going to see, KIPP, New Jersey is now opening really excellent schools in Miami. They'd like to serve thousands of kids in that city, but they're not going to be able to do it if all of a sudden every eligible school pulls themselves off and goes right back to failing for 2 years, pulls themselves off, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one substantial problem. Another is something I think we can fix with the DOE that has to do with the timing of submitting notice to districts, the timing for money to flow. So those are more at the district level, but the main one I think is that some of the entities that don't want to see this succeed have gotten very good at shrinking that list strategically, even though they're not actually improving the caliber of education kids get.
Well, thanks so much to our panelists today, and thank you very much for all of you for coming out to hear us talk for a bit. Thank you.